if we only had a 3-foot rise or 1 meter rise in sea level, we would inundate a large share of the rice-growing river delta regions of Asia. Rice, as you know, is one of the world's 2 food staples, the other being wheat. The World Bank has published a map of Bangladesh showing that the 1 meter rise in sea level covers half of its rice land. This is a country of 152 million people. In Vietnam, it's the Mekong Delta, which produces half of Vietnam's rice, that's highly vulnerable to a rise in sea level. And another 18 or 20 rice-growing river deltas that would be very vulnerable to sea level rise. So I mention that because the world rice crop would be the first of the major crops, the first of the 2 leading food staples, wheat and rice, would be the one that would be hit hardest by ice melting, by the melting of the ice sheets. But it is also the case that it's the ice melt from glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau that sustains the major river systems of Asia during the dry season. And the ice melt not only sustains the river systems, but the irrigation systems that depend on those rivers during the dry season. And when we look at China, we see a country that is the world's leading producer of wheat. We look at India, and we see the number 2 producer of wheat. The U.S., incidentally, is number 3. And then we look at rice, and China and India totally dominate the world rice harvest. So what happens to these glaciers, to these rivers, to these irrigation systems, and to the wheat and rice harvests in China and India are of concern to the entire world. In the United States, I think it's tempting for us to look at the melting of the ice on the Tibetan Plateau and say, well, that's China's problem. It is China's problem, but it's also our problem, because if China loses those glaciers and the dry season river flow from them, it'll be in trouble on the food front, and we'll be coming into the world market for massive quantities of grain in the same way that it already has for soybeans. I think this year China, which is the home of the soybean, will be importing 70% of its soybean consumption. So if China comes into the world market for large quantities of grain, it will come to the United States because we totally dominate world grain trade. And that puts Americans in a new situation, because it means that we in the United States would be competing with 1.3 billion Chinese with rapidly rising incomes for our grain supply. This would obviously drive up food prices here, and we would be tempted to restrict exports, because we've done that historically when things got really tight. The problem is that China is our banker, and it is the Chinese who are here in town every month when the Treasury auctions off securities to cover our fiscal deficit. And they've been buying our Treasury securities for years and years now. As a result, they hold over $700 billion in U.S. Treasury securities.
1.3 trillion.
In total, because they've also earned quite a bit in the balance of trade surplus. And what that means is that China's our banker. And so, like it or not, we're going to be sharing our grain harvest with the Chinese in the future, regardless of what happens to our regardless of whether we want to or not.
Shouldn't we also add in Japan, a small country that does most of its importing of food, and it's also, until recently, it was the number one trade surplus with the United States. And then behind China and Japan, we also have Saudi Arabia.
That's
and
right.
they're running out of food that they can actually grow, as they were actually wheat efficient for 20 years, and now they're not. So now these countries are buying large tracts of land or leasing them in Russia, largest country in the world as far as land mass, especially if you consider that Ukraine is an enormously rich and fertile area as well. Not that the Ukraine is part of Russia, it's not, but it once was as far as a land mass, and contiguous. And so they're going out and taking the dollars, frequently dollars that Americans, that they got from America for giving us loans, and they're buying up that using those IOUs as ways of making this deal. So we better pay careful attention to which countries cannot feed themselves in the future, and how much pressure that's going to be placing on us, especially if we're buying oil from one and having another buy our debt. Because when the Treasury prints money and it doesn't have it, we are broke as a nation. If we couldn't borrow money, here's something people refuse to. No politician says this, but this is the truth. If we could not borrow money, we would be in bankruptcy. We would be insolvent. And that's not even including our unfunded or underfunded entitlements over the next 20 years, which is $67 trillion, just that part. So when we talk about water and food and our interrelationship with other countries, this puts us at loggerheads. And why aren't we having this discussion at the national level or in the national media? Your thoughts, please.
No, it's an interesting question, Gary. I sometimes wonder if one of the problems is that things have become so complex in the world that the people who work in various government departments and so forth, who work on pieces of it, but there's no one at the top who has the time to put the pieces together and to see what it means. I mean, the idea that the melting ice sheet in Greenland could drive up the world price of rice sounds sort of far-fetched, but there's a very direct tie there. You mentioned Saudi Arabia. The history of that situation is interesting because after the oil export embargo of the 1970s, the Saudis realized that they would be vulnerable to a counter grain export embargo because they were importing most of the grain. And so they began looking for ways to produce more grain internally, and using their oil drilling technology and equipment, they began drilling around the country to see if they could find any water. And they found an aquifer about a half mile down. But it's a fossil aquifer, that is, it does not recharge. This was water that was put together in geological time, eons ago. And so they started pumping it, and as you noted, they've been self-sufficient in wheat for more than 20 years. But then last year, they made a public announcement that that aquifer was largely depleted, and that they were going to systematically reduce their wheat harvest 1/8 each year until, by 2016, they would be entirely out of the grain production business. At that point, they'll be importing all of their grain for what will be a Canada-sized population of roughly 30 million people. Now, what's interesting about this is not that Saudi Arabia losing its wheat production capacity is going to dramatically alter the world grain balance. It will not, because they produce, maybe 0.5% of the world's wheat supply. But what it does show is what happens when the wells go dry. And that's happening in so many countries around the world now. It's just that the Saudis have gotten there first, and they've been willing to go public with it. A lot of governments will not talk about what's happening with their water tables and how fast they're being depleted and what it's going to translate into. But we do know from a World Bank study of India, for example, that 15% of the people in India are being fed with grain produced from wells that are being overpumped, from wells that will be going dry one of these days. 15% of India's population is 175 million people. So that's kind of scary when you realize that a population that size, 175 million,